The Awakening. The emergency beacon tore through subspace like a scream in the darkness. Commander Elena Voss stood on the bridge of the TDFS Prometheus, her gray eyes fixed on the holographic display that shimmered before her. After 2 decades of military service, she had seen many distress signals, but never one like this. The quantum signature was unmistakable. It came from the Krell Empire, the same civilization that had spent the last 3 centuries conquering and enslaving half the known galaxy. Her second in command, Lieutenant David Park, moved beside her with practiced efficiency. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, a testament to the stress of commanding humanity's most advanced reconnaissance vessel. The bridge hummed with quiet activity as the crew worked at their stations, each face illuminated by the soft glow of their instruments. Outside the reinforced viewports, the stars stretched into infinite ribbons of light as the Prometheus maintained its position at the edge of charted space. Elena expanded the holographic display with a gesture. The message played again, and this time she listened more carefully to the words that no one in the galaxy ever expected to hear. High Chancellor Mordax of the Krell was begging for help. His voice, usually so commanding and filled with arrogant certainty, trembled with something that sounded remarkably like fear. The Devourers had returned. Lieutenant Park cleared his throat softly. Elena glanced at him and saw her own concerns reflected in his expression. The Devourers were more legend than history, a nightmare story that elder species told to explain the mysterious ruins scattered across a dozen star systems. According to the fragmented records, they had swept through the galaxy 15,000 years ago, consuming entire civilizations before vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. Most modern species dismiss the stories as mythology, the exaggerated tales of primitive cultures trying to explain natural disasters. Elena pulled up the data packet that had accompanied the distress call. Her breath caught as she processed what she was seeing. 3 Krell battle groups had engaged an unknown fleet at the Omega Threshold, a strategic choke point between the outer and intergalactic arms. The Krell forces had been annihilated in less than 4 hours. The recording showed ships unlike anything in the current galactic database, vessels that seemed to shift and pulse with an organic darkness that absorbed sensor scans and weapons fire alike. The crew watched in silent horror as the tactical replay continued. Krell warships, each one capable of reducing a planet to molten slag, fired their devastating plasma cannons at the approaching vessels. The weapons simply vanished into the dark hulls, absorbed without effect. Then the Devourers had responded. Beams of twisted energy, visible only by the distortion they caused in space itself, had reached out and torn the Krell ships apart at the molecular level. It was not just destruction, it was erasure. Elena closed the display and took a moment to gather her thoughts. Earth had maintained careful neutrality for the past 200 years, ever since humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel and discovered they were far from alone in the universe. The United Earth Council had made a deliberate choice to observe rather than participate in galactic politics. While other species fought and conquered and destroyed each other, humanity had quietly built their strength, developed their technology, and waited. She turned to address her crew, her voice steady and clear. Every person on the bridge was a volunteer, selected not just for their skills but for their ability to think creatively under pressure. That was the human advantage, the secret that kept their species safe while others tore themselves apart. Humans adapted, they improvised. They refused to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. The communications officer, a young woman named Sarah Okonkwo, looked up from her station. She had successfully established a secure quantum channel to Earth Command. Within moments, the holographic form of Admiral James Richardson materialized in the center of the bridge. The Admiral's weathered face showed the weight of the decision that lay before them. Behind him, Elena could see the council chambers where humanity's leaders were engaged in heated debate. Admiral Richardson did not waste time with pleasantries. The situation was unprecedented, he explained. The Krell Empire had been humanity's greatest potential threat for 2 centuries. Their technology was formidable, their military vast, and their appetite for conquest seemingly unlimited. Earth had spent enormous resources staying hidden from Krell attention, carefully masking their true capabilities behind a facade of primitive isolation. Now that same empire was asking for help against a threat that had destroyed their best forces in hours. Elena listened as the Admiral outlined the Council's decision. Humanity would intervene, but not for the Krell. They would act because the Devourers represented an existential threat to all life in the galaxy, including Earth. If the ancient enemy was truly returning, then every species would need to stand together or face extinction separately. The time for hiding was over. The Admiral's hologram flickered and stabilized. He authorized Elena to reveal the Prometheus and her sister ships, the full extent of humanity's deep space reconnaissance fleet. For 200 years, Earth had been building these vessels in secret, incorporating technologies that other species had overlooked or deemed impossible. Human scientists had pursued knowledge for its own sake rather than immediate military application, and that patient research was about to bear fruit. Elena acknowledged her orders and terminated the connection. She took a deep breath and keyed the ship-wide communication system. Her words would reach not just the Prometheus but the entire human fleet hidden throughout this sector. She told them that today, humanity would step onto the galactic stage. They would show the other species what determination and ingenuity could achieve when channeled toward cooperation rather than conquest. The Prometheus came alive with activity as systems that had never been used in combat powered up for the first time. The quantum drive engaged, folding space in ways that made traditional faster-than-light travel look like crawling. The ship's adaptive hull began to shift, nanomaterials rearranging themselves in response to the combat protocols Elena had activated. Around them, space rippled as 15 more human vessels dropped their stealth fields and formed up in attack formation. Lieutenant Park coordinated with the other ship captains, while Elena plotted their approach to the Omega threshold. The tactical situation was clear enough. The Devourers had established a beachhead and were systematically destroying any ships that tried to pass through the choke point. Krell reinforcements were gathering, but they seemed hesitant to engage after witnessing the fate of their forward elements. Other species were watching and waiting, trying to decide whether to flee or fight. The human fleet arrived at the Omega threshold in a fraction of the time it would have taken Krell vessels to cover the same distance. Elena studied the battlefield with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. The Devourer ships hung in space like tumors, their dark hulls seeming to draw in the light of nearby stars. They were massive, each one easily 3 times the size of the largest Krell battleship. Sensor analysis suggested organic components fused with technology in ways that defied easy classification. Elena opened a communication channel to the Krell forces. High Chancellor Mordax appeared on her screen, his reptilian features showing obvious surprise at seeing a human commanding such an advanced vessel. Elena did not give him time to question or posture. She informed him that humanity was taking tactical command of the defense. Any ships that wanted to survive would follow her instructions without debate. The Chancellor's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on desperate acceptance. He had no choice. His empire's survival depended on trusting the species he had always dismissed as insignificant. Elena terminated the connection and turned her attention to the real enemy. The Devourers had detected the human fleet. Their massive ships began to turn, orienting toward this new threat with predatory focus. Elena felt her heart rate increase but kept her expression calm. The next few minutes would determine whether humanity's approach to warfare could succeed against an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy in ancient times. She gave the order to engage. The human ships moved forward in a pattern that must have looked chaotic to the watching Krell forces. They did not advance in rigid formation or fire massed volleys like traditional battle fleets. Instead, each vessel moved independently, testing the Devourer defenses with different weapon types and attack vectors. It was organized chaos, human improvisation on a massive scale. The Devourers responded with those terrible beams of twisted energy, but the human ships were already moving, their adaptive hulls shifting to deflect rather than absorb the attacks. Elena watched as Lieutenant Park coordinated the fleet's response. They had studied the tactical recordings carefully and noticed something the Krell had missed. The Devourer weapons required several seconds to recharge between shots, and their targeting system seemed to struggle with rapidly changing vectors. Humanity had built their entire combat doctrine around mobility and adaptation. While other species created massive ships designed to absorb punishment, humans had developed smaller vessels that could change their profile and trajectory in milliseconds. The Prometheus twisted through space in a manner that would have torn apart a Krell warship. its quantum-stabilized hull compensating for forces that should have been lethal. The human fleet opened fire. Their weapons were different from anything else in the galaxy, the result of 2 centuries of research into exotic physics. Quantum disruptors created cascading failures in the Devourer hulls. Gravitational lances pulled the enemy ships into crushing fields of their own making. Antimatter warheads with adaptive yields found weak points and exploited them with surgical precision. For the first time since their return, the Devourers took damage. One of their massive ships shuddered as a series of human attacks found a critical system. The dark hull cracked, spilling atmosphere and debris into space. The Krell forces watching from their positions erupted in surprised communication. The impossible was happening. The ancient terror was bleeding, but Elena knew this was just the beginning. More Devourer ships were emerging from the depths of space, answering some unheard call. The Dark Fleet was growing, and despite humanity's initial success, they were vastly outnumbered. She looked at the tactical display and felt the weight of what was coming. This was not a battle that could be won through tactics alone. This would require something more, something that only desperate necessity could forge. The galaxy was about to learn what humans truly were. Not conquerors or pacifists, not warriors or philosophers, but survivors who refused to accept extinction as inevitable. The real fight was just beginning, and Elena Voss intended to make sure that humanity and their unlikely allies lived to see it through to the end. The Reckoning. The battle had raged for 6 hours when Dr. Marcus Chen finally arrived aboard the Prometheus. Elena watched through the viewport as the research vessel Archimedes docked with her ship, its sleek hull bearing scorch marks from a close encounter with Devourer weapons. Marcus was not a military man, but the Council had sent him anyway, along with equipment that filled 3 entire cargo bays and a theory that sounded like madness wrapped in mathematics. Elena met him in the main hangar bay as his team began unloading their equipment. Marcus was tall and thin, with the distracted air of someone who spent more time thinking about quantum mechanics than eating regular meals. His brown eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but they burned with an intensity that made Elena pay attention. He carried a data tablet clutched to his chest like a shield, and when he spoke, his words tumbled out in an excited rush. The Devourers were not entirely technological, Marcus explained as they hurried through the corridors toward the science laboratory. His team had been analyzing the debris from the damaged enemy ship, studying the fragments that human weapons had torn free. What they found changed everything. The dark hulls were alive in a way that defied conventional biology. They existed partially outside normal space, phased into a dimension where conventional physics operated differently. That was why traditional weapons failed. The attacks simply passed through matter that was not entirely present in their reality. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she processed the implications. If the Devourers existed between dimensions, then every weapon in the galactic arsenal was essentially useless. Plasma cannons, kinetic rounds, energy beams, all of them required the target to be fully present in normal space. No wonder the ancient enemy had been unstoppable. They were fighting from a position that made them nearly invulnerable. But Marcus was smiling despite the grim news. That was the thing about humans, he said. They specialized in finding solutions to impossible problems. His team had developed a prototype device based on technology that other species had abandoned decades ago. The Krell had experimented with dimensional research but gave it up as impractical. The Nexian Empire had touched on similar concepts but dismissed them as too energy-intensive. Humanity, with their tendency to pursue knowledge simply because it was interesting, had continued the research. They reached the laboratory where Marcus's team was already assembling their device. It looked more like a work of abstract art than a weapon, all curved surfaces and crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light. Marcus called it a dimensional anchor, though he admitted the name was probably too simple for what it actually did. The device would project a field that forced matter to exist fully in normal space, essentially dragging the Devourers into reality, where conventional weapons could harm them. Elena studied the prototype with a mixture of hope and concern. The device was massive, far too large to fit on the Prometheus or any of the other human warships. Marcus nodded at her unspoken question. They would need to deploy it on a larger platform, something that could generate enough power to affect multiple enemy ships simultaneously. His eyes moved to the viewport where a damaged Krell battleship hung in space. its crew making repairs after barely surviving an earlier engagement. The plan formed quickly after that. Elena contacted High Chancellor Mordax and explained what humanity needed. The Chancellor listened with his usual suspicion, but desperation had made him pragmatic. He agreed to allow human technicians aboard his flagship, the Crimson Dominion, to install the dimensional anchor. In return, Elena promised that the combined human-Krell force would make a stand that would be remembered across the galaxy. The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. Marcus and his team worked alongside Krell engineers to integrate the dimensional anchor into the battleship's power systems. It was a surreal sight, humans and Krell working side by side, their natural distrust overcome by shared necessity. Elena used the time to reorganize the defense, bringing in ships from 3 other species who had finally decided that survival mattered more than pride. Lieutenant Park coordinated the Coalition fleet with impressive skill. The Krell brought raw firepower and thick armor. The Vexor contributed their precision targeting systems. The Silicate Collective offered their quantum communication network that allowed instant coordination across vast distances. And humanity provided the tactics, the adaptability, and the technology that might actually give them a chance. Sarah Okonkwo had been monitoring Devourer communications, or what passed for communications among the ancient enemy. The signals were alien beyond anything in the database. Patterns of gravitational waves and quantum fluctuations that hurt to analyze, but she had found something important. The Devourers were not mindless destroyers. They were coordinated, directed by something that the sensors could barely detect. A massive presence lurked at the edge of the system, something so large that it bent space around itself. Elena called an emergency meeting of all Coalition commanders. They gathered via holographic projection in the Prometheus conference room, a diverse assembly of species that had been enemies or strangers mere days ago. Elena stood at the center and explained what they faced. The Devourer fleet was just the vanguard. The real threat was the entity controlling them. What Marcus theorized was a dimensional being that used the ships as extensions of itself. High Chancellor Mordax objected immediately. His pride was wounded by the suggestion that they needed to do more than simply defeat the visible enemy. But Commander Thessia of the Vexor, a wise warrior who had survived 3 centuries of conflict, silenced him with a sharp gesture. She understood what Elena was suggesting. If they destroyed the ships but left the controlling intelligence intact, the Devourers would simply return again, perhaps with new tactics and greater numbers. The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of suicidal. The Coalition fleet would engage the Devourer ships directly, using the dimensional anchor to force them fully into normal space. Meanwhile, a small strike force would use human quantum drives to penetrate the dimensional barrier and confront the entity controlling the fleet. It would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and a willingness to sacrifice everything if the mission failed. Elena volunteered to lead the strike force personally. Lieutenant Park would command the Prometheus and coordinate the main battle. Marcus insisted on joining the strike team, arguing that his knowledge of dimensional physics would be essential. After a moment of consideration, High Chancellor Mordax announced that he too would join them. The other commanders stared at the Krell leader in surprise, but Elena understood. Mordax needed to prove, perhaps to himself more than anyone else, that his species could be more than conquerors. The strike force assembled quickly. 3 human ships, fast and maneuverable, equipped with prototype dimensional drives that Marcus swore would work, despite never being tested in actual combat. Elena commanded the lead vessel, a sleek interceptor called the Valkyrie. Marcus worked feverishly in the science station while Mordax stood at tactical, his clawed hands moving over unfamiliar human controls with surprising dexterity. The battle began at dawn. Though dawn was a meaningless concept in deep space, Elena marked the time simply because humans needed such markers, small anchors to normalcy in the midst of chaos. The Crimson Dominion moved into position at the center of the Coalition formation, its massive bulk surrounded by the smaller but more agile human vessels. The dimensional anchor activated with a pulse of energy that rippled across the battlefield. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Devourer ships suddenly became solid, their dark hulls losing that unsettling quality of existing between states. For the first time, sensors could get accurate readings. Weapons that had passed harmlessly through their forms now struck with devastating effect. The Coalition fleet opened fire with everything they had, and the ancient enemy finally felt the full weight of united galactic resistance. But the Devourers adapted quickly. Their weapons intensified, and their tactics shifted to compensate for their newfound vulnerability. Ships on both sides erupted in flames and vented atmosphere. The Vexor lost 2 cruisers in the opening minutes. A human destroyer sacrificed itself to shield a damaged Krell carrier. The battle became a savage exchange where every second mattered and every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives. Elena led the strike force through the chaos, her hands steady on the controls as the Valkyrie twisted between enemy ships and friendly fire. Marcus counted down the distance to the dimensional barrier, his voice tight with concentration. The barrier appeared on their sensors as a wall of twisted space that should have been impossible to penetrate. Elena pushed the quantum drive to maximum, trusting in human engineering and a little bit of desperate hope. The transition was like being torn apart and reassembled in the same instant. Reality bent around them, and for a moment Elena saw things that her mind could not process, geometries that existed in more dimensions than human perception could handle. Then they were through, emerging into a space that was not quite space, where the normal rules of physics were mere suggestions. The entity waited for them there. It was vast beyond comprehension, a being of pure dimensional energy that had been old when the galaxy was young. Elena felt its attention turn toward their tiny ships, felt the weight of its hunger and ancient malice. This was the source of the Devourers, the intelligence that had consumed civilizations for its own unknowable purposes. Marcus worked frantically at his console, adapting the dimensional anchor technology into a weapon they could use in this strange realm. Mordax fired the Valkyrie's weapons, though the energy blasts seemed to dissipate harmlessly into the dimensional static. Elena kept the ship moving, trusting her instincts to navigate a space where conventional sensors were useless. The entity struck back with tendrils of force that reached across impossible distances. One tendril caught the third strike ship and crushed it like paper, the crew's final screams cutting off instantly. Elena felt rage and grief war within her chest, but she channeled both emotions into determination. They had not come this far to fail now. Marcus shouted that he had it, a solution born from inspiration and desperation. If they could not destroy the entity, they could sever its connection to normal space, trap it in this dimensional prison where it could no longer send its devourers to harvest civilizations. But doing so would require all their remaining power, including the energy needed for their return journey. Elena understood immediately what Marcus was not saying. This would be a one-way trip. She looked at Mordax and saw the same understanding in his alien eyes. The Krell Chancellor nodded slowly, and Elena saw something in that gesture that she had never expected to see from his species: acceptance, perhaps even peace. They armed the device and targeted the dimensional anchor points that connected this realm to normal space. The entity seemed to realize their intention and pressed its attack with renewed fury. The second strike ship exploded, its sacrifice buying them the seconds they needed. Elena held the Valkyrie steady as Marcus initiated the final sequence. The dimensional anchors shattered in cascading waves of energy. Reality screamed and reorganized itself. The entity's presence began to fade, its connection to the material universe severed. Through the viewport, Elena saw the impossible sight of the being trapped, contained within its own dimensional prison with no way to reach the galaxy it had terrorized. But there was no time to celebrate. Their ship was breaking apart, the stresses of the dimensional collapse tearing through their hull. Marcus looked at Elena with an expression of calm acceptance. Mordax stood at attention, facing death with the same dignity he had once reserved for conquered enemies. Elena felt an odd sense of completion as the Valkyrie came apart around them. Then reality shifted again. A massive gravitic field seized their disintegrating ship and pulled them back toward normal space. Elena's consciousness flickered as they tumbled through the dimensional barrier, her last thought a confused wonder about what was happening. She woke in the medical bay of the Prometheus. Lieutenant Park stood over her, his face showing relief and exhaustion in equal measure. He explained what had happened. Commander Thessia had ordered the Vexor ships to project a gravitic net at the moment of dimensional collapse, gambling that they could catch the strike force and pull them back to safety. It should not have worked, but somehow it had. Marcus was alive, though unconscious and covered in medical sensors. And incredibly, impossibly, High Chancellor Mordax had also survived. his tougher Krell physiology allowing him to endure what would have killed most species. The battle was over. With the controlling entity severed from normal space, the Devourer ships had simply stopped functioning, becoming lifeless hulks that drifted harmlessly through the void. Elena sat up despite the doctor's protests and looked out through the medical bay viewport. The Coalition fleet hung in space, battered and bloodied but victorious. Human ships moved among the wounded vessels of other species, offering aid and assistance. She saw Krell engineers working on Vexor cruisers, saw Silicate Collective medical teams boarding damaged human destroyers. Something had changed. The galaxy would never be the same after this day. Species that had been enemies for centuries had fought side by side, had trusted each other with their lives. Humanity had revealed itself not as conquerors but as allies, as problem solvers who brought solutions instead of demands. And in the process, they had earned something more valuable than territory or resources. They had earned respect. Lieutenant Park brought her a message from Earth Command. The Council wanted her report, wanted to know every detail of what had happened. But Elena smiled and told him that could wait. Right now, she needed to visit the other survivors to check on Marcus and even speak with Mordax. There would be time for reports and analysis later. She stood on unsteady legs and made her way through the ship, passing crew members who looked at her with expressions of pride and relief. Through the corridors, she could hear someone playing music, an old Earth song about coming home. It seemed appropriate somehow. The galaxy had learned what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to the edge. Not conquest or destruction, but cooperation and innovation. They had taken the impossible and made it possible through sheer determination and creative thinking. And in doing so, they had shown every species in the galaxy that there was another way forward, a path that did not require domination or submission. Elena reached the observation deck and stood looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, civilizations would hear about what happened at the Omega Threshold. They would learn about the humans who faced an ancient terror with courage and ingenuity. Some would fear humanity's capabilities, others would seek alliance. But all of them would know that Earth and her children were now players on the galactic stage. The stars no longer seemed quite so distant or cold. They were full of possibility, full of species that might become friends rather than threats. Elena smiled and rested her hand against the viewport, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's engines through the reinforced glass. Humanity had returned to settle the score, not through vengeance but through proving that cooperation was stronger than conquest. The galaxy had trembled at their arrival, but now perhaps it could begin to hope. The future was unwritten, full of challenges and opportunities that no one could predict. But whatever came next, humanity would face it the same way they had faced the Devourers. Together with allies, armed with creativity and absolutely refusing to accept that any problem was truly impossible to solve. That was the human way. That was what would shape the galaxy for generations to come.